We are back. You are chatting with John P. Today, we are going to be talking about watch microbrands that I don't hate. But first, I'd like to, and by the way, I will explain what that actually means because it sounds a little bit weird, I will admit. But first, I'd like to thank you for coming back. If you're a loyal viewer and friend, I do appreciate you hitting the thumbs up button and the like button, all that stuff, and the comments below, the episodes that you'd like to see in the future, and guys, don't forget to check out delraywatch.com. We've got a lot of interesting, cool things. We've got a big pilot. We've got some, we may have something on this list, but I don't think so, actually. But you'll never know unless you check it out. Now, let's get into the list. Microbrands. In the world of watches today, and it seems like increasingly it's become more popular of a trend, you have very small manufacturers that generally people call microbrands. Now, there's a lot of conversation and debate as to what microbrand means. You know, what are the production limits? Is it more than just production? Is it the components? And I think that pretty frequently the term microbrand gets associated with being lower quality, but that's not always the case. So for the list here, I'll say that when I chose the 5 brands here that I don't hate, it's more based on design than it is the technical components, right? Typically, a microbrand is going to be under $2,000. It's going to have some type of stock or base movement, whether that's an Asian movement or a Swiss movement. It can differ depending on the price point, but generally the marketing budgets are not very high, and the production limits are much lower than you'd see from someone like Rolex, like I have on my wrist here, the Rolex 16550. I would wear a microbrand for this, but I'll admit I don't think I currently own any microbrands. But there's something on this list maybe I'll actually pick up. So let's jump right into the first one, and this is probably, in my opinion, the most impressive from the list for the price. We have a Helios, and Helios, their most popular model is called the Seaforth. Now, I'm trying to remember here. I think the most popular version of this has this kind of like seafoam blue dial that I think was sold out within minutes. Now, this particular brand was founded in around 2009, and they've got, much like many microbrands out there, their whole mission is to create, a high quality watch that can be attractive in price. And honestly, I think they do a pretty good job. Now, when you look at their website, it's very clean and modern, and it has a lot of images relating to being a dive type of brand. It's not quite, only dive watches, because they have a few models over the years, so it's a little bit different than something like a Squale. But what you do see is some interesting versions of this. So you have the baby blue, kind of that seafoam blue. You've also got a bronze, and you've got some other models. They do have a mixture, I believe, of Asian and Swiss movements, base movements from both of those regions of the world. At least that's what their website says. I think in recent times they've been incorporating a lot more Swiss movements. But the most interesting thing about this is the watch cases are surprisingly very good quality for only a watch that's about $600 now. Pretty much everything is sourced from Asia with the exception of when they use the Swiss movements, but they do apparently have some type of quality check in Vancouver where they go through everything, and they have kind of the Western world go through it for QA, which I don't think really means a whole lot, but it could at least help the brand in their marketing. So in terms of going back to the case construction on this one, we had a Helios some time ago at delraywatch.com, and I have to say I was impressed with the case. It was much better than I thought it should be for the price point, which is attractive. So check them out. They're definitely one to look at if you like that kind of modern yet 60s inspired, if that makes sense, vintage feel dive watch with a modern take on it. That's the best I can explain the brand without using their own words. So now we have a company that I think produces some very attractive vintage, not even inspired, just vintage, how do you want to say this? Vintage design watches. So Baltic is a company that uses primarily seagull or other Asian movements, and they make watches that look a lot like a vintage Submariner or a vintage chronograph de jour, any vintage Swiss chronograph. And their price point is much like the Helios, where they're at about $600. By the way, none of these brands are paying me to talk about this. They just aren't. These are just pieces I've come across. None of these brands I have any communication with, and I really don't intend to ever have any communication with them ever, to be very honest with you. I just want to share these. And so the Baltic, they've got some very interesting designs. Like you see here, they've got a bi-compact, so it's got the 2 sub-registers. They've got some really, in my opinion, nice designs. I'll say for $600, once again, roughly, I can't really see you getting into a better piece that also makes you feel like you have something, when you can get a Seiko for that price point, but they produce such large numbers and large volumes, and I would say at something like this, you get a little bit more of a boutique kind of community experience around it, and their designs, once again, most of these I'm mentioning because of their designs. That's where they're winning. I think their designs are pretty attractive, and they give you that vintage feel without being vintage, and I mean, they're going to work. I can't say that the Seagull movements are the best in the world, but they are based off of Swiss movements that exist, so at least, the architecture is good. Now, this next brand is called Tucker, and I actually know one of the founders. She lives here in Miami. Her name is Sophie, and this brand does some interesting things. It is inspired by airplanes and a little bit of that military grungy kind of feel. They have a model that incorporates some components of, I think it's a plane from D-Day, but what I really like about this particular brand is the passion behind, one of the founders like Sophie. So when you look at some of their designs, I'll say they're really not for me, with the exception of the one here, which is the Skytrain. And I think for an ETA movement at $1,200 for the quality, we've had them here at Delray Watch. She lives down the road, basically. So we've had them here. They're very good quality. So if you like that airplane kind of theme, I think it really could work for you. But once again, what really attracts me to this particular micro brand, once again, a brand that I don't hate, is that there's a lot of passion in the founders. And I think that in micro brands today and Kickstarter brands, you see a lot of people that are trying to make, a quick buck by saying, oh, like we have this transparent model, and all of that kind of thing. And that, that whole kind of joke that floats around on the internet. But, when you have a brand like this and there's, an industry veterans behind this in the Swiss industry, and they're producing Swiss movement watches, finely made watches for this price segment, you can't go wrong. I think that when you pair that with a watch that does attract people, and they do have quite a following in the Facebook groups, there's not anything I can say bad about the brand. So it's good. Check that one out as well. Now, these last two, I would say you're not going to find everyone talking about them, particularly this brand. It's developed a bit of a following in parts of Asia, namely Singapore, where they do have some authorized dealers, but this next brand is largely untalked about, and I don't understand why. The brand is Lundis Blue, and they have pretty much one model or case shape. I think it's the 1102 if I remember correctly, and there'll be some pictures here. And I believe, and there's some information on their website about how this particular brand has developed over time, but when this brand launched a few years ago, I kind of remember them using, I believe, Miyota movements, but now they're using all Swiss movements. So I wanted to make that distinction because the price point was much lower on this particular brand a few years ago, I believe. But moving on with this brand, they produce their watches in Switzerland, so they do outsource some components, and they are very clear and transparent about that. But what they do is they provide a modern-looking watch with some timeless elements, and they really are able to offer enamel dials at attractive price points. Now, they have aventurine dials, which, I mean, some brands charge ridiculous amounts for. They have all different types of different styles of dial. You really have to check out the website Lundis Blue, link in the description below, because they have maybe 50 or 60 types of dials on this particular watch that we have here, and they have a unique and interesting dial for everyone. And enamel dials typically fetch such ridiculous premiums because it requires a craftsman to work on the dial by hand, heat up the specialized, ceramic or enamel paints, and do that whole process. So this brand is very clear that if you order an enamel watch and most of them are not in stock, it will take at least 4 weeks to produce. So when you look at a brand like this for $3,600 that can produce unique Swiss produced, or at least Swiss assembled, with some watches being fabricated in-house in Switzerland, watch with enamel dials, it's, in my opinion, it's a no-brainer. I think a lot of their designs are incredibly attractive. Now they use Swiss movements, so there's no complaints on that end. Not that I would have a complaint with, particularly an Asian movement, but for the price point, you just can't get it, even in pre-owned from other brands. So check out that one. I think I probably have to add one of those to my collection, and that's what I was talking about, because I don't see how they can offer a watch like that at this price point. So I have to find out on my own. If you're from London's Blue, feel free to reach out to me, because I do want to get one of these in my hands, and I don't think I've had the pleasure, or possibly displeasure, I don't know yet, because I've never held them. So reach out to me. I would love to talk about that a little bit more. And lastly, we have MKii. Now, if you guys are familiar with boutique brands, microbrands, and especially vintage-inspired watch brands, you probably have heard about MKii. Now, there's a guy named Bill Yao, and he founded MKii, and he has this whole wabi-sabi mentality about the brand, and it's basically a Japanese style feel and aesthetic. There's a lot more to it, and I'm not the biggest expert in that, but there's a lot of it about being timeless and having beauty and simplicity, and being able to not need to be perfect in order to be attractive and aesthetically pleasing. And that's the whole Japanese thought around that. So you have this guy Bill Yao, and he founds this brand MKii, which does make military inspired watches with that whole feel behind it. I think that's an interesting take to have on a watch brand that does not look Asian, right? You have people like Hajime Asaoka and some of the others, especially, the Grand Seikos, the Seikos, the Citizens, things like that, that are really clear in making it distinct that the watch has that Japanese heritage. But when you look at these watches that they have here, like this particular model, which I really like, the Key West, which is part of their whole military line, Benchmade for that reason. It's just an interesting perspective, and their watches are pretty well made. They're at least assembled by hand by him and some other craftsmen, and they are modeled after, for example, vintage Omega models like the Seamaster 300 with the sword hands. I think it's the 165.024. And they also have like a red Rolex sub-looking model, and this one here, which is kind of the Pan Am, I don't want to say rumor watch, but debatable, speculative watch, whether or not it actually existed and floated around. That whole conversation, which we could talk about all day, but basically the white dial GMT Master, they created it, they called it the Key West, and at $1,700, I don't think you can really go wrong, because when you look at these particular models, and I have held the MK2, and I do know people that have been part of that whole process of building that brand, and they do a really great job at, I don't want to say recreating, but reimagining something very close to what Rolex was producing. And so I would compare these watches easily to kind of what Tudor is doing with their whole lineup. When they come out with something like the Black Bay 58, I would go as far as to say that MK2 was doing the Tudor Black Bay 58 before Tudor was doing it, right? You can go on their website, you can see their rivet bracelet iteration that MK2 produces to kind of resemble what Rolex was creating back in the day. And I would say that at the $1,700 price point, MK2 is providing way better of a riveted esque bracelet than Tudor is. So that's something interesting. If you like vintage Rolex, but you don't want to get into vintage sports Rolex price points, these watches are all $1,800 and below. The case quality is there. Bill Yao was very passionate about this particular project. They've got a lot of foothold in the industry, and the watch geeks out there know about this. So if you're new to Microbrands, I think that's a really great one to check out. Now, guys, I think it goes without saying that I might not be the biggest collector or collector at all of Microbrands, but every day these brands, especially that I mentioned, and others, really seem to be going above and beyond to try to gain the attention of watch collectors like us. So I'm very excited to see what some of these brands do in the future. And it seems like every day a new brand pops up, a micro brand saying, hey, this is what we offer that's a little bit different. So anytime anyone does something that really is revolving around pleasing the customer and being as good of a brand as possible and not necessarily trying to cut costs, I'm a big fan of that in the watch industry. What do you guys think? Leave in the comments below. I want to hear the types of micro brands that you're into. Is anything on this list interesting or attractive? Let me know. It's Friday. I've got to finish some things up. And have a great weekend, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, Instagram, The Real John P. You have been chatting with John P. Ciao.